greatest population it would ever have. This is sort of the high water mark of Lanark, Illinois, at about 1,300 people. So not a huge place. On April 9th, a craft that the local newspaper described as an airship, that's the term it used, something exploded in the sky, and there was a ruby-colored glow in the sky, and numerous people saw it, and it crashed. And a group of men, it was still kind of cold and not quite wintry, but northern Illinois, winter lasts quite a long time. There was snow on the ground in April, which is not unheard of. Group of men from the local area get together to go find this thing that had crashed. And supposedly, according to the news reports, although we'll get to why the news reports might not be the most reliable thing ever here, it crashed on a farm, a craft owned that the local newspaper, a German farmer named Johann Fliegeltaub, which is a great name, Johann Fliegeltaub. And it killed 2 of the 3 supposed occupants in the craft. The third member of the crew, who was described as the pilot, was slightly injured. And according to the news reports, the day after the crash, Farmer Johann was allegedly charging the townsfolk $1 apiece to come see the crashed vehicle. As we'll see, this might not be the most reliable report. $1 apiece to see the wreckage, and the newspaper, the one newspaper in the county, arrived on the scene. The reporter he called himself General, I don't know if he was a general, F.A. Kerr, and he was writing for the Mount Carroll Daily Democrat. And if you go on the internet to like newspapers.com, you can pay money, which I don't like to do, but you can pay money to actually look up in the archives. You can find the news reports for yourself. F.A. Kerr, maybe a general, he arrived on the scene, and he said he was so disturbed in the article that he swallowed 2 cocaine tablets in order to steady his nerves. Now, I'm not au fait with the ins and outs of cocaine. I don't think cocaine has ever steadied anybody's nerves. I'm not sure. But he steadied himself with some cocaine, and he talked about, he met the pilot, and this is what he wrote. I found the unknown wanderer lying on a lounge, and I approached and examined him closely. He was about medium height and of athletic build, with long curled hair, dark brown, and an extremely handsome face. He wore a white tunic reaching to his knees, and on his feet were sandals strapped with tinfoil. The tunic was embroidered with a coat of arms, a shield with a chain of sausages, and a ham sandwich on it. A few minutes after I entered the room, he awoke and sat up. Immediately, everybody fled, except myself. After looking around for a minute, he said in a language that I knew at once to be Volapük, and I'll explain that in a second. Where am I? I answered, near Lanark, on Earth. And he said he was glad to be there, and asked how it happened. I explained the circumstances to him, and we had a long conversation. He told me that he and his companions were an exploring party from Mars who had been flying over this country for some weeks, explaining the other sightings of aircraft that had happened. They probably saw us. We've been around. Around midnight, he expressed a desire to see his wrecked machine, and I went with him to visit it. When he saw a hole in the window, with his fingers he bent the torn metal and brought a pot of pasty-looking stuff, which he spread over the hole and then he ran hastily to the barn, picked up the bodies of his compatriots, and carried them to his ship. Stepping inside, he pulled a lever which set the propellers whirring, and the machine dragged itself from the ground. The crowd was awestruck by the proceedings. I myself, to whom nothing is strange, returned to Lanark, and securing a room at the hotel, sat up all night smoking opium and eating hashish, to get in condition to write the story. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to be one of these knee-jerk skeptic types. I want to believe the tunic with the crest with the ham sandwich. I want a tunic with a crest with a ham sandwich. I would wear that every day. But it doesn't strike me as the most credible report. There were reports the next day, and that sort of the one that you just heard was sort of the second day. The first day was something blew up and it crashed. And then the third day, there was a note from the editor explaining that the whole thing had been made up. And it was sort of never spoken of again until I saw it in a magazine article about 10 years ago. Volapük, the language that the aliens spoke, is real. Volapük is a constructed language like Esperanto that was invented in the 19th century by a German priest who had a dream in which God told him to create a new language. So that's a real thing. And actually, Volapük, the language itself, comes up in a couple of these crashed airship stories. There's I think the reason it comes up is because the Lanark one hit first, and then other Volapük stories appear. And you have reports of people going to crashed airships, making sure they had a Volapük to English dictionary with them. Because apparently, the people who flew here from Mars in machines that had propellers, anybody know why propellers might not get you from here to Mars? Yeah. The propellers were for show, to make the humans feel at home, probably. So, I love the Lanark, Illinois story, and I love it. I don't think there's enough there for a book, but man, I might try. A much more well-known 19th century event happened about a week later, and you may have heard of this. This was in Aurora, Texas. Little town of Aurora, Texas. And there's a brief newspaper account by a man named S.E. Hayden, and it was for the Dallas Morning News, so it wasn't a local sort of county-wide newspaper. The Dallas Morning News was one of the major papers in Dallas. It still is one of the major papers in Dallas. And the story was filed on April 17th, and it said that at 6 o'clock in the morning on April 17th, the early risers of Aurora were astonished by the sudden appearance of the airship, which has been sailing throughout the country. So again, kind of like some of the other, like sort of the aftermath of the Lanark thing and the comments in the Lanark story about how people, you may have seen us flying over your country. A lot of these stories about these mystery airships sort of draw the conclusion that this is one ship that everybody seems to be seeing in the country. So that's an interesting connection. It slowed down and gradually settled toward the Earth, and then collided supposedly with a windmill. It might not have been a windmill, and went to pieces with a terrific explosion, scattering debris over several acres of ground and destroying the flower garden of the owner of the house. The pilot was the only one on board. His remains were badly disfigured, but, quote, enough of the original has been picked up to show that he was not an inhabitant of this world. Mr. T.J. Weems, the United States Signal Service officer and an authority on astronomy, gives it as his opinion that he was a native of the planet Mars. Papers found on the person are written in some unknown hieroglyphics and cannot be deciphered. The ship was too badly wrecked to form any conclusion as to its construction or mode of power. It was built of an unknown metal resembling somewhat a mixture of aluminum and silver. The town people looked at it, gathered specimens, and they gave him a funeral and supposedly buried him the next day. And there the story ends for decades. It was in this newspaper, and then it was not really talked about. It doesn't show up in books for a while. In the 1960s, attention stirred up because people found the article and started looking into it. And many of these cases, Roswell, for example, Shag Harbour for another, the incident takes place, and then decades later, you have people looking into it with more detail. It happens, it's in the news, and then it sort of fades away. And then later, it's revisited. And there were sort of two waves of Aurora investigation. And the investigations in the 1960s were highly critical of what had gone on. The story said the craft crashed into a windmill. They looked at records, they talked to people in the area. There was never a windmill for it to crash into at that place. So there's little bits that are falling apart. People who were alive at the time and would have been aware of such an event going on said that there was nothing like that. That didn't actually happen. Signal Officer T.J. Weems did not exist. He was probably named after Jeff Weems, the village blacksmith. So we did have that little bit of, there's an army man there to explain the crashed object. But he wasn't really an army man. And so things died down. He said, there's no mysterious metals, there's nothing there. And then a decade later, in the 1970s, they come back to it again. Some investigators come back to it again. And it's an investigator named Hayden Hughes looks at it. And mysteriously, now in the 70s, there were eyewitnesses that apparently didn't speak up in the earlier investigation. A woman named Mary Evans said, quote, "The pilot was torn up and killed in the crash. The men of the town gathered his remains and said he was a small man and buried him that same day in Aurora Cemetery." A guy named G.C. Curley said, quote, "My friend said there was a big crowd of sightseers who were picking up pieces of the exploded airship, but no one could identify the metal it was made of. We didn't have metal like that in America at the time, and they said it was difficult to describe the pilot. They saw only a torn up body." So we've gone from the story being forgotten to the story being investigated and dismissed to the story being investigated with witnesses who have shown up. And with some people saying, well, there are some bits of metal, and I have them. And so some of the metal is turned over. And then later in the 70s, there was another investigation that sort of took apart most of the story that had been positive about Aurora. Curley, one of the stooges, Curley, the witness who said it was a strange piece of metal nobody could identify, his name wasn't actually his name that he said it was, and records show he wasn't actually living even in Texas at the time. He said he witnessed all this going on. Mary Evans sort of issued a kind of harsh renunciation of how she was quoted, and she said, what I was doing is I was telling them what the newspaper said happened. None of that actually happened. She says, you took what I said completely out of context. While there was some metal found, it didn't seem abnormal. It was not really strange at all. There was some metal that some people claim didn't act as it should. Metal with a high iron content was exhibiting no magnetic properties, for example. But there was a lot of difference of opinion, even between UFO organizations. APRO, the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization, Coral Lorenzen, Chris mentioned Coral Lorenzen a bit earlier, her group investigated it and said that this is normal. This is normal metal. There's nothing going on here. But a brand new organization called MUFON that had started up said, you know what? There's something here, and we're going to look into this. We think there's enough information to ask the town officials to dig up the body, because there had been a tombstone supposedly placed where the spaceman's body was. And so the MUFON people said, well, let's exhume the body. Let's get an order to exhume the body. And the town said, no. And the MUFON investigators said, well, why not? And they said, because we don't even know who put that headstone there, and we're pretty sure it's a hoax. We're not, and even if there is basically go away. Don't dig up our graveyard. The MUFON investigators were able to spin this in various ways, but they sort of the investigators. I read the report and they played it both ways. They said, well, if they would have let us dig up the body, it's proof that there was. Then we could prove there was something there. Since they didn't let us dig up the body, it's proof they're trying to cover up there was a body there. Of course, if they would have let us dig up the body and there wasn't a body there, they might not let us dig up the body because they don't want us to find out that there's a hoax. And so no matter what the townspeople said about it's okay to dig up the body, MUFON had a way to sort of say, well, Any way you crack it, it proves that we did this investigation well, which is a good way to do things. In the end, not really any solid evidence, strange little bits of evidence-shaped things, but not solid enough evidence. But there's still people pursuing it. It's this, on the sign there, the picture, that's the Aurora Cemetery, and the historical marker does mention the newspaper reports. It doesn't take a position on whether the newspaper report's true, but it says that this did happen. The most, even among many UFO researchers, one of the most accepted explanations of what happened is that with the airship craze in the spring of 1897, this was a way to get some attention to Aurora, which by 1897 was a town that was dying. I don't know how it is, and it's probably the same in any place on Earth, but a town is planted in a place because at some point there are expectations that economically this town will succeed. And in the late 1800s, that success depended on access to railroad lines. And Aurora believed it was going to get a rail line, it was going to be a stop on one of the major rail lines, and the rail company changed that. And so the railroad bypassed it, and later you have this, well, what can we do to get people's attention? Now, I'm not sure pretending to have a dead spaceman is an economic thing. I'm not sure you could go to the town fathers and say, look, I know the railroad didn't come here, and I know everybody's moving out. I got an idea. Let's tell people that there's a spaceman and that he's dead. I don't think that's great. On the other hand, 100 years and a couple months after this happened in Aurora, you had the 50th anniversary of Roswell. And a town that by the 90s really had nothing going on. The military had moved out. There wasn't a lot of industry there. That town saw a massive economic boost from the 50th anniversary of Roswell and the subsequent festivals there. So maybe Aurora was just ahead of its time in the field of UFO tourism. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe. Moving into the 20th century. Maury Island in Washington. Here's the trivia question. Here we go. Okay. It's an easy one. This is an easy one for this crowd. I can tell from looking, you guys are going to know this one. The question is, who I see raise their hand first, who is forced to take the book. June 24th, 1947. Thank you. You win the book. Come see me afterwards. See, I knew I should have done something. I should have said, what was the name of the fake army officer in Aurora, Texas, who then I couldn't get rid of my book. So a few days before Kenneth Arnold saw 6 objects shaped like chevrons, in his words, skipping like saucers through the air. An incident occurred in Washington State that would be one of the most convoluted UFO stories ever. June 21st, 1947, near Maury Island, which is in Puget Sound in Washington State, there was a harbor patrolman named Harold Dahl, D-A-H-L. And when I say harbor patrolman, a lot of times that sounds a lot fancier than what it really was. This was not a harbor patrol sort of guiding ships and making sure. This was there were logs that tended to roam around the harbor, and the job was to push the logs out of the way with a big pole. That was sort of what they did on this harbor patrol. Harold Dahl, his son Charles, the rest of their crew are on board a patrol craft, and they see 6 donut-shaped objects, kind of like that. Close enough to a saucer, right? Donut-shaped objects. There were 6 of them. 5 of them were sort of circling around one in the middle that seemed to have a hard time staying aloft. So you have 5 sort of donuts spinning around a central donut that looks like it's in a bit of trouble. It seemed to be damaged. It passes over the patrol boat, the story goes, and ejected stuff. Some kind of metal. It's usually described as slag of some kind. And there was actually two different substances. The first was a thin, white, newspaper-like metal, which I assume means sort of thin and flexible. I don't know what newspaper-like metal might be. Sort of thin, foily sort of things. And another was black and similar to lava rock. In fact, here's a spoiler. It was probably lava rock. But the thing is, it comes down, it hits Dahl's son on the arm, injures his arm. Another piece hits and kills their dog, who was on the boat with them. Of course, the problem is, there's another story later on that, well, no, the thing crashed, and the weird materials we found were part of the crash site. So, did it crash? Did it eject metal? It depends on who you ask on which day, which is one of the problems with some of these crashed saucer stories. The story changes, and it's hard to get to what really happened. So the story gets confusing because it was told multiple times and multiple people. And Kenneth Arnold, who had seen these saucers after it happens, Ray Palmer of Amazing Stories magazine, and we'll hear more about Amazing Stories magazine in a minute, sent Kenneth Arnold, who at that time was the flying saucer expert in America, because he's the flying saucer guy, sends him to Washington State to figure out what's going on with this. And Dahl tells Arnold that he didn't report the incident to anybody when it happened. He didn't talk to anybody. He didn't tell the story. But nevertheless, the next day, he says he didn't tell anybody. He says some strangers dressed in dark clothes arrived and warned him not to tell anybody about what he had seen. Does that type of thing sound familiar to anybody? Yeah, Men in Black. If you want to sort of pinpoint the beginning of the Men in Black story, this is the modern post-47 Men in Black story. This is a good place to do that. Dahl didn't think much of it because the Men in Black weren't actually a thing. Nobody had heard of the term Men in Black yet, but he was wondering how these men knew that he had seen this thing and why he was being warned not to talk about it. He's like, I don't know, maybe one of the other guys on the boat talked, right? That's actually a pretty reasonable explanation. Dahl didn't tell anybody, but there were other people on the patrol boat. But then he said that the logbook in which he'd recorded the incident, that those pages had gone missing. That the logbook had been taken. More than that, and this is weird, but it's in the FBI file about this incident. And so it's one of those things that the strangest parts of this are not, hey, there was a thing in the air. It's all the people around it afterward. His 15-year-old son was treated for his injury, although researchers have not been able to find any actual medical records of where he went or what the injury was. His son disappeared and was found a couple days later in, the FBI agents weren't sure, either Idaho, I think it was Idaho or Wyoming, working in a restaurant with no idea of how he got there. It's just, that's strange. Dahl talked to his supervisor, a guy named Fred Chrisman, and told him about it, and eventually Arnold showed up, and when Arnold met with Dahl and Chrisman told the whole story, did most of the talking, which Arnold thought was really strange because Chrisman hadn't been there. Dahl was the actual witness. Dahl kept quiet, Chrisman told the story. Arnold examined the material from the incident and thought it was the lightweight stuff was aluminum and the heavy black stuff was lava rock. That was, he's a pilot, he was familiar, he says, this is aircraft grade aluminum. That's what this is. But Dahl claimed he had taken some pictures and he was going to get them to Arnold eventually. And Arnold thought, well, there's stuff did fall out of something. There's this weird aluminum slag. He says he has pictures. I don't know what to do with this. I'm going to call the Air Force. And so he called up the Air Force officer who he had talked to about his flying saucer encounter back earlier. And July 31st, 47, he calls Air Force Lieutenant Frank Brown. And Brown, along with a Captain William Davison, show up from California. And their report that they sort of telegraphed back to the Air Force was that Dahl and Chrisman had made up the story. and that the material was normal industrial slag. But they wanted to take a sample of it back to the Air Force just so they had something on record. And then another one of those weird things happens that makes this story a perennial favorite, along with the proto-Men in Black showing up, along with Dahl's son winding up with short-term amnesia in some diner somewhere. The plane that Brown and Davidson fly back to California on, one of the engines blows while it's in the air, and the crew flying it is able to parachute out, but Brown and Davison are killed in the crash. So, if you have a conspiratorial mindset, you've got the guys who investigated it, who have supposedly some material evidence from the incident, die before they can make their final report. The Air Force ruled there was no sabotage, and planes crash. But it's one of those things where, as the story develops, this is weird. There's other things that make Maury Island, the crash, significant in the broader history of the subject. First is the Men in Black, and then we have the plane crashing. But Fred Chrisman is a strange. How many of you have heard of Fred Chrisman? A couple of you. Fred Chrisman is an interesting guy. In the 1970s, John Keel, a paranormal writer and researcher, and others, but Keel's the one who wrote the most about this. He'd done some research back into some earlier issues of Ray Palmer's Amazing Stories magazine. And have any of you heard of a man named Richard Shaver? Yeah. Richard Shaver was a writer in the 40s who wrote these stories that he claimed were true for Amazing Stories, and they were incredibly popular, about how the earth was hollow and inhabited by a good race of beings called the Tyros, and a bad, mischievous, evil race called the Diros. And these were published in a science fiction magazine, but Shaver claimed they were real. Keel looked back in some issues from 1946 of Amazing Stories, and he finds a letter which he believes is from an F.L. Chrisman, Fred Lee Chrisman, a letter to Amazing Stories where Chrisman claims these stories about the hollow earth are real. Chrisman claims that during the war, he was on an island in the Pacific, and that he had entered a cave, and the cave went really deep, and he had encountered these beings, and he had been zapped by one of their heat rays, and he'd been injured, and he had to fight his way out of the Diro cave with a machine gun. So before Maury Island even happened, one of the guys who would become involved with this story was already writing to Amazing Stories with strange tales of the hollow earth. Later, in the 1970s, Charles Dahl would resurface talking to some people and say, you know what, you want to hear something strange? You know that TV show, The Invaders, with Roy Thinnis? Anybody remember The Invaders with Roy Thinnis? He says, those stories are Fred Chrisman's stories. He told me those things happened to him. That show is like a real account of his life. Which is just strange. And it gets weirder with Fred Chrisman. Back in the 60s, when Chrisman was starting off, sort of going from being a harbor patrol boss to being a radio talk show host in Washington, being a radio talk show host in Washington, Jim Garrison, who prosecuted Clay Shaw in relation to the Kennedy assassination, actually implicated Chrisman as one of the three hobos who were involved possibly via the CIA with the Kennedy assassination. So with this one man, Fred Chrisman, we have a sci-fi story about underground people possibly claiming to be real, a TV show about aliens that people claim is based on his life. He shows up at the first evidence of the Men in Black and something crashing from a modern saucer, and he might have worked for the CIA and been involved in the Kennedy assassination. It is It is an amazing rabbit hole. And it became famous for UFO famous, which is different from real famous, but UFO famous for all those reasons. If this is a rabbit hole that you have decided you have way too much time on your hands and you want to look into, Ken Thomas has written a book called JFK and UFO that goes into the Maury Island case and all the things surrounding it in horrifyingly exhaustive detail. So, some more cases. Roswell, just a little bit about Roswell. Not a lot about Roswell. Roswell, Chris mentioned that I love how he says this, in 1967 in Canada there was no Roswell. That is a great way to sort of explain the fact that after the initial news reports about the Roswell Army Air Force captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region, and then the denial of the story later, weather balloon, it sort of goes away. There's a couple reasons it goes away. One was that the general public in the 1940s and 50s, the general public had an overall sense that the government's probably not lying to us, as opposed to more recent decades where it's impossible to fathom the government not lying to us. It's weird, actually. A little aside, when I talk about things like Watergate and Vietnam and various CIA things to my students, these students are, I think the oldest among them is a little older than I am, so not too old, but and most of them very young. They have trouble believing that there was a time when, not just in the United States, but in the West in general, that there was a time when people pretty much trusted the government and believed it was working in their best interest. And that, there's a time when the Air Force said it was a weather balloon. There's no story here. Let's move on. It goes away. There's little mentions of it. There's mentions that something crashed and the Air Force then said it didn't. But in 1980, the Roswell Incident by Charles Berlitz and William Moore was published. And Stanton Friedman, although he wasn't one of the authors listed, did a lot of the actual research on the case for that book. He writes his own book, Crash at Corona, a bit later. And the Roswell story emerges right at the same time that in the United States and the West in general, there is an increasing distrust of government. There have been cover-ups that have been proved and demonstrated. And so why wouldn't there have been a cover-up like this? So Roswell's popularity develops at the same time as more political forms of paranoia and conspiracy theory are growing as well. So Roswell sort of reemerged at the right place at the right time. And more witnesses started to come out. People who said, I was there. There was a craft. There were bodies. Here's some metal we can't identify. There were markings. Little bodies, markings, materials we can't identify. These things, as you know now, these things didn't start with Roswell, did they? You see these things in Aurora. You see these things at Maury Island. So it's not surprising that in this conspiratorial period of the 80s and 90s, when we're getting shows like The X-Files and the almost unknown and forgotten Dark Skies. Anybody remember Dark Skies? Did that make it up here? Yeah, it was terrible. It was bad television, but I have a soft spot for it. As we get into the 80s and 90s, there's almost a sense that if the Air Force says it was a weather balloon, that is proof it is not a weather balloon. Because if the Air Force or the CIA or anybody says it, it can't be true. Because why would they tell us the truth? They're covering something up. And the thing is, yeah, they probably were. The question we have to answer, or at least consider, is, in all of these cases, what's being covered up? Is it an alien crash, or is it something else? But there's almost no doubt, at least in my mind, that yeah, people have been lied to for a very long time about these things. And one of the effects of the lies, and this is an important point to keep in mind, as if, like me, you're interested in the hobby of mistrusting everybody and everything around you and gradually going insane, is that everybody is going to lie to you, and the way they lie to you in such a way that the truth is then argued about by everybody who thinks they're lying, and no consensus might ever emerge. And the people telling the lies, their work is done. We tell a lie that may be a fairly obvious lie, and then we let all of the people at the community center at the UFO festival argue about it and deny whatever explanations they don't agree with, because they've got this mindset that it was an alien craft, or it was a mobile balloon, or it was any number of things. And the great thing about Roswell, one of the things about Roswell that I like the most, and I do like some things about Roswell, it's not my favorite case, but it's a pretty good one, is that in recent years there have been some really wacky Roswell theories that have emerged. Nick Redfern's book, Body Snatchers in the Desert. Who's read Body Snatchers in the Desert? Go do that, maybe. Or not. It's one of our speakers tomorrow, Paul Kimball. He and I both agree that it's probably not right, but I think it's more entertaining than he does. I think he's nodding. It's like, I don't agree with it, but it's fun. Nick Redfern argues that from testimony he's gotten from people who were there at the time, it's his view that the Roswell crash was actually a crash of not alien beings, but possibly Japanese prisoners of war that the government was experimenting on in high atmosphere tests, and that the reason it was covered up is because it could be considered war crimes, especially since it happened 2 years after the war was over. Some other crashes after Roswell, the one that sort of pops up, it's a zombie, it's a bad penny, it's whatever cliche you want. It's the Aztec case in New Mexico. And the great thing about Aztec, I'll be honest, the great thing about Aztec is the book cover of Beyond the Flying Saucers, because it's so lurid and pulpy. And it all starts with the man on the left, a man named Frank Scully, who was not a journalist, not an investigator. He was kind of a gossip and humor columnist for Variety, which was the Hollywood newspaper at the time. And in October of 1949, he reports that he's met with a bunch of scientists who have told him about a couple of crashes, but there's one here in the States. They pulled 16 small bodies out of the wreckage, and those 16 bodies were charred, dark brown, because of air that came in through a hole in the windshield. The atmosphere must have darkened their skin. But the autopsies done by the Air Force, which recovered the bodies, showed they all were perfectly human but tiny and had perfect teeth. I don't, for when they eat us, right? Like that Twilight Zone episode. They have perfect teeth. The book comes out later, and it turns out that the man on the right, a man named Silas Newton, was the source of Scully's story. Silas Newton was an oil man. He had an oil company, Newton Oil. He claimed to have a device that would use magnetic waves to find oil reserves, which isn't real. But he had this device. Scully claimed he's a brilliant man, tops in his field. Scully claims he got the story from Dr. G, a top government scientist who had gone rogue and was investigating this saucer crash. What ends up happening is there's this story about the crash saucer. There's no witnesses apart from people who won't give their real names. And a couple years after the story broke, and other UFO organizations like NICAP said there's nothing to the story, it's a hoax, Newton and Dr. G, whose real name was Leo Gebauer, were convicted of fraud for selling fake oil detecting devices to investors. And so if you want to know why Roswell disappears, it's because Aztec was considered at the time to be such an egregious hoax and fraud that probably all the other stories about stuff crashing in New Mexico are as well. And so the flying saucer research community moves on to other things. There are still people who maintain that Aztec is real, that Dr. G was not one man, but 8 different government scientists. There's a book published just last year by a guy named Scott Ramsey that goes into this. There were other crashes. 1965, and this is sort of the one I'm going to end up with. I got the high sign from Noah back there, so I'm going to end up with this one. Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. You heard of Kecksburg, Pennsylvania? It's a good one. That's a picture I took. 1965. There is a streak of light from Canada going southeast across part of the Great Lakes region. It supposedly makes a course correction, crashes in the tiny town of Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. Pieces of debris rained down all along this flight path. Some were discovered in Lapeer, Michigan, about 20 minutes away from where I live. Something crashed in the woods. Firefighters went in, state police went in. Eventually, witnesses see military officials going in. The official statement is, there is nothing in the woods. Oh, can we go back and look? No. You can't go back and look at the thing that doesn't exist. But there was a volunteer fireman who claimed later that he was actually in the woods before they cordoned it off. So he was already back there, and he saw an object that he described as an acorn-shaped object that was orange with a gold band around the base with some hieroglyphics on it. This is a model that the people of Kecksburg have put up. You see that, then you go into a bar, and there's a gift shop in the bar, and you can buy a Kecksburg shot glass. They said there was nothing there. Later, witnesses saw a flatbed army truck taking off a giant object under a tarp out of the area. People were turned away, told not to go back into the woods. Later on, when the witnesses came forward who said they had been there in the woods, there's some speculation that it might have been a Russian space probe, which had re-entered the atmosphere around that time, but the timing wasn't quite right. Other suggestions of space junk. NASA said categorically it was not a Russian satellite, and then in 2005 issued a statement that it absolutely was a Russian satellite. However, you can't look into it because all the records about Kecksburg that NASA had were destroyed in the 1990s. Now, I'm just a simple country historian. I work for a community college that has saved every piece of paper since 1923. I don't know, maybe they did lose it. It happens, but I don't know. So, you've got the thing in the forest where a guy 20 years later says, yeah, I saw that. You've got Roswell with stories that it was a top secret torture test, or that it was actually beings from the inner earth, which is a nice callback to the Hollow Earth stuff. You've got Aztec, in which the people who came up with the story were proven fraudsters. You've got made-up newspaper stories and hashish-eating reporters. And then you've got Shag Harbour, which, if you didn't think it sounded like a solid, credible story before, after hearing about some of these other UFO crashes, by comparison, good grief. You've still got witnesses alive and willing to talk about it on the record with their names. You've got government documentation. You've got the letters UFO attached to the government documentation. You've got U.S. military markers on Canadian territory. You've got all sorts of stuff that there's something solid there. So there's similarities between all these cases. There's stories and trends that go from thing to thing to thing that keep things consistent, that show developing mythology. And you've also got, in Shag Harbour, a comparison with a case that's really, really solid. And if Shag Harbour is never as well known as Roswell, is never as well known as Aztec, is never as well known as Kecksburg, so be it, because it's a better story, with better evidence and better witnesses, and having been to some of these things, a better UFO festival, honestly. Folks, there was pie last night. There was pie. Come on. That's all I have. Thank you very much, and I'll get you your book.